So Russia is mobilizing more troops for its unrelenting war on Ukraine. At least 300,000 reservists are said to be called up as Moscow looks to boost its troops. President Vladimir Putin has signed a decree on partial mobilization, which will begin today, citing what he says is the defense of Russian territory. Some global leaders have labeled the move an extreme escalation of the war since Moscow's invasion of Ukraine in February. Meanwhile, Putin has called out Western leaders for what he says is threatening to use nuclear weapons against his country. Let's talk about this now with Gabriel Crouse from the Institute for Race Relations. A very good afternoon to you, Gabriel. Welcome back to Daytime Update. So, is this a sign of Russia that's panicking after those advances that were announced about a week ago by Ukrainian forces in some of the territory it held since the start of the invasion?
I think that is certainly one way to look at it. On the other hand, it's always been clear to Russian observers that they've been fighting with one hand behind their back. Estimates of the total troop deployments thus far has ranged, but it's never really gotten north of 200,000, and usually it's at around 150,000 Russian troops, but they've got a standing army or standing reserve capacity that gets to 2.5 million. So at this stage, in the last couple of weeks, the Ukrainians obviously made quite good gains in the north, and I think what might have, from a Russian perspective, provoked this move is that after the Ukrainians made those gains, Zelensky made comments to say, look, he's not going to end the war until he takes back all of the territory, including the Crimea, which the Russians are never going to give up. And Putin was saying, look, let's try and broker a bit of a peace deal. But the Ukrainians and NATO were rebuffing that. And so the Russian response then is to call up another 300,000 troops and deploy them in order to take back all the territory that's recently been lost and take the rest of Donetsk Oblast.
On paper, at the beginning of the invasion in February, it appeared that it was going to be a quote-unquote easy job for Russia to do because it had the larger military, it had better military resources, yet more than 6 months into the invasion, Ukraine has still been able to hold some ground, yes, not completely successfully, but it seems to have taken even the Russians by surprise, would you agree, in just how long it's been able to fight back. Is that purely down to the assistance from the West?
Yeah, I mean, it's always worth remembering that this war started in 2014, and that Russian troops almost certainly were engaged in this war before the invasion in February, and that certainly troops from Donetsk and Lugansk were engaged. And that America in particular, but NATO more generally, had been supplying the Ukrainians with munitions, with smart rockets, with from NATO side, with with jets that are equal to anything Russia has. So the thought that the help only came after the war started sort of misses the point. And if you think about America's big political scandal, where Donald Trump was on a phone call with Zelensky, at stake was whether or not America was going to continue handing out arms to Ukraine. And that's back in 2019. That's several years ago, and ever since then, the Americans have continued to supply the Ukrainians with troops, with arms. The Ukrainians, at the beginning of the war, actually had a larger standing army than the Russians deployed forces, and had the best of the best coming from NATO. What they didn't have was the kind of long-range missiles that would be needed to try and reach Moscow, for example. And so in that sense, there was an asymmetry. Moscow could hit Kiev, but Kiev couldn't hit Moscow. But other than that, the Ukrainians have always been, I think, relatively evenly matched, and I think that's what we've seen play out in the battlefield.
You mentioned 2014, the annexation of Crimea took place around that time. Now we're hearing back to discussions in the south and east of Ukraine about votes on annexation referendums. Now, if those do take place, the likes of the United States have already said at the UN that they would not recognize that vote should it go ahead. But do they even care? Does it make a difference if the West does not recognize them?
I think they'll go ahead, despite the fact that the West won't recognize them. Part of what's complicated is that, of course, in Crimea, there was such a referendum back in 2014. The Russian argument is that the deposition of the Ukrainian president at the time was unconstitutional. It certainly was. And this created a crisis of legitimacy, which opened up the legal international law room for a referendum on sovereign shifting. In any event, people at the time, commentators at the time from the West, said that those that referendum was bogus, that Russian army troops were basically forcing people to vote da to join Russia. But if you look at Washington Post and Levada surveys done just last year and done repeatedly in between, Washington Post being very anti-Russia and pro-America, those surveys showed that 80-90% of Crimeans really would much rather be in Russia than in Ukraine, which they consider largely to be a neo-nationalist state of an unhelpful sort. Of course, Ukraine is the poorest and most corrupt country in Europe, etc., etc. And by that stage, the Ukrainians were turning off the taps, literally trying to dry out the Crimeans. So there was real hostility. That's all to say that as a result of that referendum, which seems like maybe it wasn't as bogus as it was being made out to be, the Russians felt very legitimate in holding on to Crimea. But in the intervening 7-8 years, the Americans and NATO have never shifted on thinking that Crimea belongs in Ukraine. So I think that we're dealing with a very tragic situation where the two sides are not going to see eye to eye. The Russian argument, like it or not, is the argument that has persuaded most Russians, and the American argument that Russia is an aggressive imperialist nation that's just going to try and grab as much land as it can is also not moving.
But
so I think,
Gabriel, is either side, or in fact are both sides, do you think becoming clearer on the reality that at this stage it does not appear that there'll be an outright winner whenever this ends?
Timothy, I think that's a wise observation, but maybe an overly optimistic one. I think that it is a fact that no one is coming out of this as a clear winner. But I think on both sides there are jingoists that basically enjoy the political rewards of a polarized world, that enjoy having a common enemy, that all of the problems in America, all of the problems in Russia can sort of be blamed on some outsider. I think that there are some feedback loops, negative feedback loops, that just keep reinforcing the cycle of violence. As I just said at the start, the failure for there to be any serious indication of peace talks is part of the partly contributes to 300,000 more troops being added to the mix. And you can be sure that as a result, NATO is going to send in billions and billions, tens of billions of dollars worth more of smart bombs and equipment like that. And, Vladimir Putin's threat that nuclear assault is not a bluff needs to also be read in the context of the Ukrainians allegedly shelling the largest nuclear power station in Europe, which, if the shell is properly deployed, would create a massive nuclear blast. So in a sense, both sides have nuclear weapons, and both sides might be willing to use it, which would certainly be the kind of situation in which nobody can conceivably consider themselves a winner. I think, unfortunately, this brinkmanship is leading us to a mad place. Mutually assured destruction is a 1950s concept, but it's very much a 2020s reality, potentially.
Briefly then, the announcement today by Vladimir Putin this morning comes at a time when his country is getting a lot of condemnation at the United Nations General Assembly underway in New York. Do you think that too is linked to the timing of this? Because already last week there was already reporting around the advances by the Ukrainians and escalations in some parts.
I think it might be, but I think that the logic of this is more dictated on the battlefield. And in the sense that after the Ukrainian gains were made, no real olive branch was put out to say, we'll go this far, but we're not going to go any further. The gamesmanship at the United Nations is a significant factor too. I just think that it's not necessarily as significant.
Gabriel, Crouse, good to speak to you.